Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, it's my pleasure to be here at FII for what promises to be a really exciting panel. My name is Jane Witherspoon. I'm the Bureau Chief for the Middle East for Euronews, and I will be introducing my guests very, very shortly, our panel that we have for you today, and where we're going to be talking about tech for equity. Now, the world faces a wave of future financial crises, and the bottom half of the world's population possesses just 2% of total wealth, while the richest 10% controls 76%. Women, I'm pleased to say that we're a female-dominated panel today. I'm sorry, Jacques, but you're in the minority for once. Women earn only 1/3 of the global labor income, and millions of people worldwide face the threat of insolvency, with global household debts reaching $300 trillion. So we're going to hopefully find some solutions, have a nice discussion. So I will, without further ado, introduce our panel. To my left, we have Dr. Jacques Attali, President of Attali Associates. Thank you so much for joining us. Fatma Shenawy, Co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer for Khazna. We have Dr. Saeeda Jaffar, General Manager for the GCC for Visa. Hello and welcome. And last but not least, we have Ambareen Musa, CEO of Souqalmal. Thank you, guys. I wanted to start, Ambareen, in terms of new technologies, solving age-old systematic challenges to create a more equitable world, you have a bit of exciting news that you're going to announce today, don't you, in terms of the technology?
Oh, absolutely. I'm not sure about announcing today, but I do want to tell you a little bit what we're doing from our side concerning technology, education, and closing the gap between the rich and the poor. To my belief, it's all about education.
Sure.
Right? I think the education is the basis of it all, from closing the gap between the rich and the poor, but it also allows people to empower themselves to take the future into their own hands. And the more education you have, the more knowledge you have, naturally that goes into closing that equity gap. During COVID, a little story, during COVID, we, as I'm not sure how much of you know, but we sold, Souqalmal got sold to Showa Capital, got acquired 4 months ago, and at the back of that acquisition, during the COVID period, we had calls from CEOs saying, listen, you guys are very well known for financial education in the region. We've dropped salaries by 30%, and people are taking their kids out of school. People are losing their jobs and losing their mind, being very less productive. But more importantly, they're losing employees to competitors for $200, $300 of salary increase. That brought a lot of thought process into our mind, saying, well, there's obviously a huge lack of education and awareness when it comes to personal finance. And so the news I have today is we've decided at the back of that to build the first financial wellness platform in the region. That entails 4 different verticals. The first one is education, everything from budgeting to asset allocation. The second one is connecting you seamlessly to credit. The third one is robo-budgeting, that I call it, where we spit out a budget depending on who you are and what your current level of spend is. We connect to all your banks. And the fourth one goes into wealth management. So at the back of that, when we talk about systemic challenges, it is all the basis of education, and we're trying to build a platform that is here to stay through corporates for every employee to pick up on, and hopefully bring that level of education awareness in the region to a very different level.
Jacques, you are very, very keen and an advocate for the importance of education in any level, not just financial education. Why is that such an important foundation and start for everything?
If we want to fight against inequality, education is the key point, and I like to say so. There's nothing but education. I must say that education is one of a single sector of innovation which is able to reduce inequalities while a lot of other sectors of innovation are increasing inequalities. If we look at the past, whatever is linked to communication, the printing machine, the mobile phone has decreased inequalities, but the other innovation have not, because the other innovation have created wealth for the wealthy, and before they spread, another innovation come and create a new advantage for the wealthiest, and then It's why the wealth is accumulated in a small number of men. Only education and communication are technologies where you can have a chance to reduce inequalities, but not sure. As we speak, EdTech is just good for people which have the means to have it. We have a family to support them, who have a good environment in terms of health, human rights, access of women to education. And then it's mainly also a question of out of innovation of rule of law as a key for using innovation for reducing inequalities. And in that sense, education is a must. Even as we speak, education is on the contrary a way to help the richest to have a better access to best education, best universities, and is increasing the inequalities.
You touched on something there in terms of the innovation and the technology moving at such speed that, by the time that it is generalized, it's moved on.
Yeah.
Surely that's just part and parcel of things developing, but how do we keep up with that then?
We should not forget that the best way to get equity is tax
Okay.
and transfer.
Sure.
If you let people accumulate wealth without organizing transfer, whatever we say is peanuts.
Thank you. Saeeda, why is it important at the end of the day for people to be financially literate? We mentioned some of the statistics earlier. Why are they being left out of the traditional financial fold?
Sure. That's a very important question, right? So there are many statistics everywhere that some of them very scary statistics that say in many traditionally developed economies, emerged economies, as much as 2 out of 3 people are considered to not be financially literate. So 2 out of 3 not financially literate. There is equally a lot of data that shows that for a lot of adults who we would consider as not financially literate, their economic certainty later on in life is a lot rockier than for those of us that have that understanding, that know what it means to really and truly manage their money well. Given this, if we think through this and we play it out further, what does it mean? If a large part, if 2/3 of an economy lives in a state of economic flux, how does that economy thrive? How do you make sure you're focused on solving the real challenges? And how do you make sure you're progressing and you're innovating and tackling some of the issues that really and truly exist? So that's why, from our perspective, we are fundamental believers of economies that include everyone, uplift everyone. And it is incredibly important to make sure that there is a focus on financial literacy, financial education from very early on, to make sure that we continue to innovate and perform at our full potential.
Well, Visa have a number of initiatives as well that you roll out globally to encourage that positively. Can you talk me through some of them?
Absolutely. There are a number of things we do, and innovation is very dear to our heart. We are, globally speaking, we are the world's first fintech ever. We were established many years ago, and we are the world's first fintech. And we are constantly innovating as we go forward. So some of the ways in which we have been trying to open up innovation is, for example, something called Visa Everywhere. This is an open innovation platform where we invite entrepreneurs from all over the world to come and share their ideas. And based on their ideas, we will then create, let's say, the right avenues for them to pick some of them and then to coach them, mentor them, even help in many ways. We've recently done one in Saudi. So just a few months ago, we had our first one in Saudi, yes, and it was fantastic, and we hope we will continue to do many more. Yeah.
Fantastic. Fatma, you're coming at things from a slightly different angle and target audience. Your business really looks at mid to low income, not at the bottom, but quite close to there. If you're giving access to financial services, how do you do that responsibly so that people aren't going to get themselves into some serious debt moving forwards?
Sure. So I'm just going to take a few seconds to paint a picture of what our target user looks like. So that's the typical mid to low income, someone who lives barely paycheck to paycheck. So whenever an expense comes up, and that's quite frequently, they just don't have the means to pay for that. So it's what we're actually doing is bridging a liquidity gap. So what they're doing in the market now is going to family, friends, and even to employers to bridge that gap, because the best they have when it comes to access to financial services is a bank card where they get their salary transfer. But that's pretty much it. They don't have access to credit, they don't have access to savings, they don't have access to the full range of financial products. So we come in and we bridge that gap in a way that's transparent, that's convenient, that's simple, that works for them, but in a digital-only solution. So I think without the tech component, it wouldn't have been possible to reach the users that we have right now, because we're targeting millions, and we're just scratching the surface. And we're seeing this problem across the entire region. So we started in Egypt, but we're also expanding across the region because it's happening everywhere. I think when it comes to doing that responsibly, so the way we've thought about it is with stacking different products that really have an impact on the user and their lives and their families as well. So we started with the cash side of things just because that's the big need in the market where we operate. But we started also having bill payments. So, you know, they have to pay their utilities, they don't have the money to pay for it, they do it instantly in app. We started doing things on the buy now, pay later side and stacking things that are more relevant. So we're doing things like, with our partners, we're doing medical insurance. So then when they're able to insure their families, medical expenses don't just ruin the entire month for them or the entire, you know, few months for them. So that's how we're tackling this. In a way, we're educating them, but we're sort of gamifying it for them, or delivering value through that gamification process or that education process, so then it would make sense for them.
Let's talk regulation.
Yeah.
What is needed in terms of a successful financial equity strategy moving on from that? Because I think you've witnessed what is in place in Egypt, and now you're expanding here in Saudi. Can you talk me through that?
Absolutely. So when we started late 2019, it was really the idea that this problem has been in the market for so long. We've grown up with this problem, but we thought it was the right time because from a user perspective, they're digitally connected in a way that we've never seen before. But more importantly, from a regulatory perspective, the regulator is very progressive, and financial inclusion was a top strategy in the country. So with that came a lot of regulatory frameworks, and with that also was a mind shift in how things were perceived by the regulator. So it became the idea that we're going to do this with the support and the cooperation between the fintechs and the banks. So the fintechs are out, we're out on the ground, we know our users, we do all these offerings and things for them that an incumbent would shy away from doing, but we have the support of the incumbents and the banks from a regulatory perspective. And the regulators are sitting with us, you know, talking about new regulations, introducing sandbox, keeping us involved in the conversation, looking at different regulatory regimes and different things that have been done in markets across the region and globally. And we're seeing the same in Saudi. So just, you know, yesterday there was a big conversation around open banking. There's the wage protection system all around the GCC. And what that gives us when it comes to financial inclusion is it gives us data that allows us to provide services and stack the range of financial services on top of that in a way that's affordable.
Jacques, I think you tried to get my attention. Were you wanting to add into
Yes, because I was not aware that we are going to discuss financial services, but in one of my lives I worked and I founded an organization who worked for more than 25 years in microfinance in more than 60 countries.
Yeah.
The name was Planet Finance, and now it's Positive Planet. And I think everything you said is right. When we began, there was only 5 million people using microfinance in the world. Today, we may say that 500 million. Regulation is a must, absolute. Education is fundamental. But there is another issue that I advise you to add to that, which is the fact that there is a contradiction between fighting for equity and climate.
Right.
Because if you move only to help people create their own job, without trying to understand what kind of job they are going to create, they may create dirty jobs, dirty entrepreneurs, bad food, waste, without any waste control. And then I urge you, and it's what we do in this organization, only to try to focus on creating what I call positive companies, positive SMEs, screening not only the fact that they are sustainable financially, but also sustainable ethically, sustainable politically and socially, and sustainable in terms of ecology. And that means that a lot of small business that are created should not be created because they worsen the situation. And I think that in the long term, when people globally will have a choice between fighting climate change and fighting poverty, if we do not reconcile the two goals, they will choose fighting climate change and not poverty. And it's why we must transform fight against poverty as a tool for a better climate situation and not as an enemy of climate control.
I think Ambareen's got something to interject there as well.
So the interesting point that you brought in was without tech, you wouldn't be where you are, right? The company wouldn't exist. And of course, technology has allowed us to really build up our audience or customer base. But I think we should actually take a step back. 75 million Americans still don't have broadband. So I think the issue doesn't just come in education and technology and what we can do, but it goes way back where it's great to have technology to democratize education, if I said that right, which is what we are trying to do. But if you go back to people who don't even have access to broadband, that's just getting them worse and worse and worse. So to actually close that gap, I think there is an added, to your point, an added problem that we should probably add on the list, which is, let's think about the governments and the private sector and the investors who, first of all, needs to understand and figure out how to build infrastructure, especially in rural areas, in the US, in Africa, in emerging countries, it's even worse. But I think there is a step back we need to make and say, how do we build and how do we fix the infrastructure problem before we try and democratize financial education, all the edtechs and the fintechs that's coming through. What we have seen during the COVID, if you just look at students, for example, during COVID, the number of students that could not actually go to school. Everything went online, but broadband or laptops or internet was just not accessible. And that's where I think, the danger is you've got the bigger and bigger equity gap through the market.
So how do we solve that, that accessibility issue?
And I think that's where you need to bring all stakeholders. I think, Saeeda, you mentioned that earlier on. It's everybody getting together. It's not just investors. It's not just the startups. It's not just the fintech. It's the governments, the regulators, the telco companies to build broadband where it needs to be done. Now, how do they do that? Do they need to be subsidized, or do investors need to start looking at social impact investment? And what does that mean to them? So I think it's a convergence of regulators, investors, startups, fintechs, all together to first build infrastructure to make sure that people have access to the internet. As simple as that. And eventually then move into...
If I may add something to COVID has created a disaster for long term.
Yeah.
Because people have not, as you said, been in position to go to school, but figure is that more than 40% of people which have not been to school for 18 months didn't go back to school after. And 80% of these 40% are girls. And a large part of those girls are going to get married very young, which means that they no education and they will not be in position to help their children to be literate. Therefore, this 18 months lost at school create a disaster for 50 years for the whole of Africa mainly, part of India, large part of Mexico and many other countries. And it's almost irreversible, almost irreversible.
Well, this is obviously the theme of the conference as well, and when we're looking at humanity and how to make things better, I guess there is that issue of who is responsible and how do we take control of that and make things better. And I wanted to say to Fatma, how would you like to see us creating a financial ecosystem? We're talking about people not even having access to the internet, and on the other hand, we're talking about fintech and AI. which sounds ridiculous. You know, in your eyes, what's the best way forwards when we're looking at the future technology?
I think one of the positive things we've seen from our perspective with our users is because of COVID, there was more, people were more aware of the importance of digital. So we saw more people coming into getting connected. I mean, from an infrastructure perspective, whether it's here, whether it's back in Egypt, the infrastructure is there. It's accessible even in the rural areas. You know, we have people, parts of the team who go and, you know, onboard the users wherever they are across the country, just to get them educated that face-to-face interaction as a first initial starting point is important for our user segment. But the connection is there. Sometimes it's a matter of financing that first smartphone ever. Sometimes it revolves around that. Sometimes it's education or the concerns around how do I use that smartphone? I've never used one before. But from an infrastructure perspective, I think it's there, at least in Egypt. In Saudi also with the introduction of Tawakkalna, because you know you need to get access to your work through that. So that made smartphone penetration really pick up in Saudi. So that's from our perspective, the positive side of COVID. There've been a lot of negatives, but there's also positives. So I think that's there, and our role at this point is to create value for the user. So we're seeing from an infrastructure perspective when it comes to finance, a lot of new infrastructure that's being developed by the regulator as well. So Egypt, we just kicked off our instant payment network, and that's an infrastructure that allows peer-to-peer transfers instantly, 24/7 across all sorts of accounts, which we didn't have before. We're seeing here in Saudi, like I mentioned, the open banking, which allows just a lot of inflow of data. So I think with that sort of evolution of the infrastructure and being aware of what's going on around the world, not just in the region, but globally, and bringing that home in a way that works for the users and allowing the fintechs to really develop something that works for the target segment. Like, we know that the things we develop for our user doesn't work for everyone, but we have a user in mind and we think about their problems, we think about their journeys when we're developing that product, when we're developing the communication for the message to get across to them. So I think that's really going to be the way forward for bringing more people into the system.
Saeeda, you talked earlier about the kind of ecosystem and the initiatives that have driven a lot of your research and rollouts over the last couple of years. You know, what has been the most challenging part of that, and what would you say was the biggest thing you guys have taken away, Visa as a company?
Sure. So I think the biggest theme in a lot of, frankly, what we've talked about and what we also see is every situation is different.
Yeah.
And every situation, while we have a common set of tools, the solutions are extremely specific. And what may work in one place and one setup doesn't necessarily work in another, right? So you gave a great example, 70+ million Americans that don't have access to broadband, to the internet the way you would like. But equally, if I look at some of the most populous countries, the way the internet has fared in China or in India, and the way, especially digital payments have taken off in those countries, it's completely different than how it has happened in other parts of the world. So it's not linear. It's absolutely not linear. Each and every situation can have a very different solution. There is an ability to leapfrog. And the point is that instead of trying to force-fit a solution that may work somewhere else, build on what exists and build on what are the, as you said, some of the most fundamental and some of the most pressing challenges that exist. And I think once you get that baseline right, you can then keep continuing to go on and to keep taking steps from there.
Jacques, would you say that we can future-proof from forthcoming financial crises?
We are what?
Can we future-proof further crises?
Of course not.
Can you enlighten us?
Of course not.
Yeah.
The future crisis is there. And the reason of a crisis is linked to the fact that people, mainly men, I must say, procrastinate. When there is something to be done, they say, let's wait, we'll do later. And the best way to say we do it later is to print money. If you print money, you give time and you say, we wait. And then the central banker print money, the politicians say, well, I have time, then I do nothing. And then everything is ballooning and we have a crisis. The crisis is the consequence of procrastination, and it's a traditional kind of course, financials will go on, at least as long as we don't put in place a real global architecture with sound, lucid analysis of what is scarce, what should be spared, what should be invested, which is far from being the moment.
This is definitely promoting women in politics. No more procrastination, more women.
More women. You're saying that because you're on a panel full of women.
I
This, I mean, this is probably a question for all of you. Actually, you probably all want to chip in at some point. But how can investors help reduce the digital divide?
Help what?
How can investors help reduce the digital divide?
By all means, we should have that criteria in mind. Personally, when I'm looking at an investment, I ask myself, is it good for climate? Is it good for equity? Is it good for human rights? Is it good for women parity? I ask all these questions. Is it good not only now, but in 10 years? Because an investment is for more than 10 years. Then I dream of a world where every one of us, when we buy something, when we save, when we invest, when we vote, if we vote, we will have all those questions in mind and not make any decisions without doing that. If all investment funds in the world, IFI as well as private investment funds, have that question in mind, screening through indexes, and it's beginning to come, but it's very slow, then things will change. It has to be a global new behavior in front of decision making.
Yeah. Ambareen, do you agree with that?
Yes, I wish I had the same dream, but I'm not there yet. I'll get there at some
You're
point.
not there.
Not there yet. Having said that, I think the first question for them to ask, or investors should understand in the first place, why it's good for them that they're actually trying to help close that divide. I think the bigger the divide, the more impact it has on a macroeconomic level. The more divide you have between the rich and the poor, the more it creates political instability. The more political instability, the more issues you have in investments, and it's a long-term issue that a lot of investors face. Now, I don't know, and I'm not sure whether that comes out when investors do invest. Do they think about the macroeconomic side of things from the issue of a digital and the economic divide? I'm not sure yet, but I think that's probably the first question to ask. And I agree with Jacques, is one of the areas they should be looking at is, what are the KPIs of this investment? What's the purpose of this investment? Is it just financial returns? Or can we start regulatory-wise putting things like, it's not just financial return, but it's also socio-economic, it's social impact, it's level of education, level of awareness, connectivity in a country could be one of the areas to build investors to try and close that divide.
An investor will understand that it is in their interest to be altruist. It's why I call selfish altruism. You have an interest to be altruist because, as you said, if you create a world where people are all affluent, that's a more stable world. You have more potential consumption and growth. Therefore, it is an interest of the wealthy people to fight against poverty. Hard to understand, but it's absolutely fundamental. Selfish altruism.
Yeah. We're talking quite on a global scale there as well, but obviously if I throw this over to Saeeda and Fatma, you're very much GCC closer to home. Are you seeing things from a different perspective here?
Yeah. So I think the one thing I would add to that is, yes, while the investors have the one view and they will look at it, and there are other factors as well, I think we equally have a very important role to play. We as individuals can also put our hands up and say, hey, this is important to us. And this is something that we also demand. That's one part of it. But I think equally on the other side, a lot of us individuals, entrepreneurs, is also up to them to make sure that there are creative solutions that come in and that address some of the challenges. Because what investors, at the end of the day, they're there to make a return, but they need supply and they need to be maximizing a demand of something financial, but also others. So I think it's also equally up to us to be able to make our voices very clear in terms of what is important, and then also be able to put our work behind what that is. In the GCC, we are starting to see a lot more awareness and a lot more push towards social causes and towards creating social enterprises. And like most things in the GCC, once they pick up, you see them accelerate. and you see them taking form very, very quickly. So I think if we have this conversation in the next year or two, it'll be a very different outlook than today.
Fatma?
I agree 100% with Saeeda. I think it's a shared responsibility. From one side, investors making this a priority, but realistically, to expect investors not to look for returns is just unrealistic. So it's our role as individuals, as entrepreneurs, whether that's someone in a startup or a big corporation or anywhere, to think about the creative ways to solve big problems in a sustainable way, in an economic way that works for, for creating a company and works for investors as well. I think in the markets where we operate, or in emerging markets in general, there's a lot of very interesting problems to be solved, and there's a lot of creative ways to solve these problems. It's not linear, just like you mentioned. Every market has its own dynamics, but that's part of the rush of it, and part of the interesting part of doing this day to day is you got to figure it out. In different markets, there's a lot of synergies, a lot of learnings shared, but every market is unique, every problem is unique. But we have a lot of them, unfortunately, but it creates a lot of opportunities that I think would work for both, building a business, but also from an investment perspective.
Yeah. I think just to add on to that, so I get the point where it's unrealistic to ask investors. Having said that, though, it's interesting to see how governments and regulators in the last few years have really, and they've done that on the whole climate change story, and that's going to be moving on. I believe that's going to be the next step for the financial education and awareness and literacy, where you start getting tax incentives if you invest in certain companies or tech companies or ed tech, or even infrastructure that actually helps reach a certain economic goal that the regulators have. So I think, yes, I agree that the financial returns is a big part of it, but I do believe the ecosystem can build up different reasons and different KPIs or returns, type of returns.
Yeah, so I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. So if I think about us, we are a purpose-led company. We have a very, very, very clear vision of making sure we're bringing individuals as well as small, medium enterprises into the financial fold. And this is something our chairman and CEO has talked about at length, and it is something that is in a long-term plan for us, and we are working towards it. At the same time, we are also a very financially responsible company, and we have investors as well. So I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive, and I think it's, as you said earlier, it's up to us as individuals to find the right models and to make sure that we're able to somehow marry the two and do what we think is the right way.
And build the awareness as much as we can.
Absolutely.
And I think also, like you mentioned, the government and the regulator plays a role, because if investors are long-term investors, the regulators are there for good. So they're the ones seeing really the long-term view of things.
Lots of food for thought, ladies and gentlemen. We're going over time, so we have to wrap there. But Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed panel, thank you so much for this conversation. We'll take it backstage.